Okay, so David has given in broad brush terms the idea of what a mixed system will be, and as he says, it's a slightly complicated proposition. There are lots of individual components that go together to make up the whole. So what I'll be doing here is just focusing on those components and outlining some of the choices to be made. So the first one will be the balance between the list seats and the constituency seats, how many of each. The second one is how would we elect, how would we fill the constituency seats. Thirdly, how do we elect, how do we fill the list seats. And then there are some other aspects which are maybe slightly technical, but I'll elaborate those when we come to it. So firstly, the balance between constituency seats and list seats. How many of each should there be? Well, usually the ratio is roughly 1-to-1, and that's the situation in Germany. In Germany, there are 299 constituency seats, 299 list seats. In other countries that use this, the ratio is something like 1-to-1. It doesn't have to be exactly 1-to-1, but if the constituency seats are filled by the first-past-the-post method, then you'd need roughly 50% of all MPs to be elected through lists, because the first-past-the-post seats can generate a lot of disproportionality. Bigger parties get a lot more seats than their fair share. Smaller parties get a lot fewer seats than their fair share. So you'd need more or less the same number of list seats to redress those imbalances. So at the next election, we're due to have a total of 158 TDs. So that would suggest something like 79 to be elected from single-member constituencies, 79 from list seats. Now, in some cases, as I say, the balance is a little bit more towards constituency seats in particular, but it's usually around that. Now, as I'll elaborate in a moment, and as was raised earlier, maybe the constituency seats don't have to be filled by first past the post. Maybe they could be filled by some more proportional method. And if that were done, then we would not need quite so many list seats, because the imbalances arising in the constituencies would not be quite so large. So if there was some version of PR used to fill the constituency seats, and that does get a bit complicated, but if that were done, then the proportion of list seats could be lower. So the German system anyway is the sort of basic model here. Prototype, and the ratio there is something like 1-to-1. So that's the balance between the two, and then we've got the question, how do we fill the constituency seats, how do we fill the list seats? How should the constituency seats be filled? Well, I'll divide this into two. First, simple, straightforward methods, and then secondly, more complex schemes. So the simple, straightforward method, well, in actual MMP systems, mixed member proportional systems, this is nearly always done by first past the post. That's the way it is in Germany, in New Zealand, in Scotland, in Wales. The constituency seats are filled in the way that seats in Britain, in Northern Ireland for Westminster elections, are filled simple first past the post. That's the way it's done in actual cases. It doesn't have to be done that way. It could be done in other ways. For example, we could keep single-member constituencies, but elect the MPs, the TDs, instead by the alternative vote. That's the system that we mentioned at the previous weekend on this. That's the way in which we elect the president. That's the way in which we fill by-elections. Well, again, there's only one seat to be filled, but we vote 1, 2, 3, and so on for candidates. But in practice, the alternative vote tends to deliver pretty similar outcomes to first past the post. In particular, that the level of proportionality is really no better using the alternative vote than it is using first past the post. So both of those ways of electing constituency TDs are pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Everyone could figure out what's going on. And as I said before, this would need roughly the same number of list seats as we've got of constituency seats. So we'd need something like 79 list seats alongside 79 constituency seats to ensure a reasonable degree of overall popularity. Maybe it could be 90, 70, something like that, but the balance would have to be fairly close. So those are the simple ways of filling the constituency seats, and the ways in which, or particularly first past the post, the way in which, in practice, it's always done under the MMP systems actually working in the world. But we could rack our brains and come up with more ingenious and complex schemes. So another alternative would be to have the constituency seats filled by some kind of PR system. That could be a list PR system of the sort that we were told about at the previous weekend, or even by the current system, PRSTV. And if the constituency seats were being filled by proportional representation, then the number of list seats we would need to iron out discrepancies would be smaller, because there wouldn't be such big discrepancies. So the proportion of list seats could be smaller. So, for example, we could imagine a scheme where 158 TDs were elected. 120 of them could be elected by PRSTV, maybe in 24 5-seat constituencies, and then there would be a 38-member national list constituency. So that would be an alternative way of doing this, because the 120 TDs would be elected by a form of PR. We wouldn't need such a big number of list seats to guarantee overall proportionality. There are a couple of complications there. One would be the ballot paper design. You've seen in the briefing documents, and we saw last week, an actual German ballot paper, an actual New Zealand ballot paper, which is pretty simple and straightforward. There's two lists, or two sections to it. On one side, you make a cross to elect your local constituency MP. On the other side, you put a cross for the party you want to vote for. That's pretty easy. Now, if there was one section dealing with electing 5 TDs by PRSTV and another section to pick a list party, then the ballot paper would look pretty complicated. Maybe there'd have to be 2 separate ballot papers. Would this be? I'll deal with questions later, Arch. Would this be an ingenious scheme, or would it be really a bit of a kind of dog's breakfast of a ballot paper? So that's one potential complication. Then another one relates to the sort of personal mandate that individuals are given under PRSTV. That if, say, a party ran 3 candidates in one of these 5-member constituencies, and 2 of them were elected from the 5-member constituency, and then the third one, having been rejected there, got elected anyway by the list, then there could be legitimacy problems. The voters might say, well, we explicitly had a choice, we explicitly voted that person out. We're not too pleased that they're elected via the list. And that would be particularly the case if being a list TD was somehow perceived as a better deal than being a constituency TD. If the list TD, for example, didn't have any constituency duties and could spend all their time being, as David put it, a philosopher king, that might cause particular resentment. So more complex schemes are possible, but there would be things to think about if that were to be seriously contemplated for implementation. So that's how we might fill the constituency seats. How about filling the list seats? Well, in practice, that's nearly always done through closed lists. So in Germany, New Zealand, Scotland and Wales, as David Farrell's outlined, the parties put forward closed lists, and if the party is entitled to whatever it might be, 25 seats from the lists, then it's the top 25 names on the list who get those seats. So the lists are closed. Voters don't have any opportunity to express a preference. If they really like someone who's rated number 68, well, too bad. They've got no way of showing that that's the person they want. If someone is placed at number 3, who's extremely unpopular, the voters don't want them, well, again, there's no way for them to express that. So as Charlie Flanagan alluded to earlier, that means that now candidate selection within the parties becomes a really key battleground. And I think that's a general point, that under PRSTV, people see candidates of the one party competing with each other for votes, but in fact that kind of competition within parties is inherent in the whole political process, and if it doesn't emerge in an election in a way that just transfers it to another stage, namely the candidate selection stage. So now when it comes to deciding the order of names on the list, candidate selection becomes extremely important, because everyone knows if you're ranked very high on the list, you've got a very good chance of being a TD. If you're ranked low on the list, absolutely no chance. And candidate selection in nearly all countries, including this country, is a very much a private process within parties. Every party decides entirely for itself how to pick its candidates. And that would no doubt continue to be the case. So the various options we could think about, the most kind of open or an inclusive way where the parties would decide all our paid-up members should have a role in deciding the order of names on the list. There should be as open, inclusive, democratic process as possible. They might decide that. They might go to completely the other extreme and say the party leader alone is going to decide who should get onto the list, or in what name people should be ranked on the list. Or it might be somewhere in between. Maybe the leader would propose, the national executive would decide, or branches would propose, the national executive would decide, whatever it might be. But anyway, that would certainly become a key and crucial internal party process. The party body responsible would, in effect, be making decisions about who TDs would be. And what kind of people would be put on the list? Well, we can think of, again, a whole range of possibilities. The ideal, the dream scenario is that the parties decide to put, shall we say, experts, people with real expertise, to redress any imbalances in the constituencies. So if not enough women, not enough young candidates were being selected in the constituencies, the parties could stack up the list with more members from underrepresented groups. That would be the best scenario. The worst scenario is that the party leader would pick the people, and they'd be the party leader's cronies, as it's sometimes disparagingly termed, or the people on the lists might be in practice pretty much the same kind of people that were picked in the constituencies. Maybe the people who weren't picked at constituency level would be put onto the list, or maybe the composition of the list would reflect all of those tendencies. There'd be some people put on there for their expertise, other people because they're close to the leader, and other people who were just unlucky when it came to candidate selection in the constituencies. And the other question to be raised about the list, TDs, will be really the question of just who they would be accountable to. It's obvious who the constituency TDs are at the moment and would be under this system accountable to. They're accountable to the voters in the constituencies. Who exactly would the list TDs feel accountable to? They might, in practice, as David Farrell says, in practice they might align themselves to a constituency. They might set up a constituency office there and think of themselves as just another TD from that constituency. Or because they were elected from the list and they know that was only because they were placed high on the party list, they might think of themselves as accountable to the party candidate selectors, whoever that might be, whether it was all of the members or the national executive or the party leader. So they might behave as if accountable to the candidate selectors. And that raises the question generally, just what do we want from list TDs? Do we want them to be much the same as the constituency TDs, or do we want them to be different kind of people and doing what and answerable to whom? So that's how we might elect the list TDs. So I mentioned three main aspects. Now there are a few other ones as well of a more technical nature perhaps, so I won't spend quite as much time on these. But one question would be, should we have one national list or should we have regional lists? In other words, should we elect, if we had 120 TDs from constituencies, 38 from lists, should there be one national list and one national constituency of 38 TDs, and all the parties would put forward lists of 38 candidates? Or should there be regional lists, maybe one in Munster, one at Connaught Ulster, one in Dublin, one in the rest of Leinster? If we have regional lists, as the overhead says, the list TDs might have a closer connection to the area, and that could be good or bad depending on exactly what we want from these list TDs, but there might be less proportionality if proportionality was only being decided at regional level. The question of a threshold would come into play. Should there be some kind of threshold that parties would need to exceed in order to get any list seats? In Germany, parties don't qualify for any list seats unless they reach 5% of the national vote. There is another sort of backdoor route if they win three constituencies, but that's only happened once. In practice, parties need 5% of the national vote to qualify for list seats. So if we were to adopt that threshold, and New Zealand has something similar, then it's immediately obvious. Everyone in the room, certainly every politician, can immediately think which parties would exceed that, which parties wouldn't, and which parties' fate might at some elections be a little bit marginal. So Sinn Féin, as recently as 1997, won only 3% of the votes. Labour in 1987 won 6% of the votes. There might be times when both of those parties would be in danger of losing representation. At the moment, they're both very comfortably above the 5% mark, but they might both feel in danger at some elections of falling below it, and other smaller parties, such as the Greens, the United Left Alliance, will be a long way short of 5%. At the last election. Now, if there were a threshold, it wouldn't have to be 5%, it could be 2%. There doesn't have to be a threshold at all. It could be operated without any threshold, although all MMP systems do in practice have some kind of threshold. Then another of these more obscure aspects maybe is how independents should be treated. David Farrell mentioned this already. It would become more difficult for independents to win a seat in a constituency than at present, because the ratio of voters to TDs would be twice as large as it is at the moment in the constituencies. And if we were to think of independents being elected from a list, there would be problems there. And I put in more detail in the briefing document. We can imagine ideas like a party of independents running in the list section, but that gets a bit complicated, and a voter in Clare might vote for the party of independents, and the result might be that someone based in Donegal was elected, and the voter in Clare might not really feel particularly represented by that. So that's something else to think about, but it does seem that whatever device is chosen will be harder than at present for independents to be elected. Then we've got this idea of overhang seats or surplus seats, which is really getting a bit complicated. But this happens, as David Farrell said, because parties might win more constituency seats than they were entitled to overall. So one simulation I've seen of the last election is that Fine Gael would have won 71 seats in constituencies. It was only entitled to 60 seats overall, so it would not have won any list seats whatsoever. Even the number one name on the Fine Gael list would not have been elected. And if the German practice were adopted, then the size of the Dáil would have had to be increased by 11 to accommodate that. So it's a kind of technical and complicated thing, but there's no absolutely satisfactory way of dealing with that. Then getting on to a couple of more, finally, rather arcane aspects, but this is something that emerged only after MMP was used in a variety of settings. MMP, it turns out, is the easiest of all electoral systems to manipulate, to give rather kind of false results, because parties can run decoy parties or fake lists. This has happened in such places as Italy, Albania, Lesotho. I won't go into all the complexities. I'll just give one example. In Albania, what the parties did was they ran their constituency candidates as independents. Everyone knew in the constituency that person is really the candidate of the PSK party or whatever. That candidate is really a PSK person, but we're going to register them as an independent. And so then when the list seats were shared out, the PSK party could say, we haven't won any constituency seats. We need a good share of the list seats. And of course they did, because technically there hadn't been any PSK candidates elected from the constituencies. So that's a kind of trick or device, and there are other ones too, such as decoy parties. So this is a kind of problem that's really never arisen in either Germany or New Zealand, either because the parties don't know about it, or maybe because they fear that if they tried any tricks like this, the voters would punish them. However, in Italy, Albania, Lesotho, the voters didn't punish them. The voters thought the system is there to be exploited, so to speak, and if parties can do that, that seemed to be fine. So if there were to be a mixed system in this country, the question is, should there be some thought to legislation to try and prevent such strokes, or could the voters be relied on to punish any party that seemed to be trying to manipulate the system? So, okay, there are just a few of the detailed things we'd have to think about if there were to be a mixed system in this country. So having outlined those, I'll finish there. Thanks.
Michael, thank you very much.